Hi, everyone. Welcome to the first of our live shows where it's either Alicia, Joelle, myself on and talking more about the podcast that dropped on the Monday. So, as the Monday episode was around psychosocial risk assessment, we'll be further exploring that theme today. Basically, we wanted to test these things out, see how we went. Obviously, the live panels get a lot of people. The last live panel, for instance, that we ran with Angela and Adam had about 1,000 people tuned in live, which is fantastic. So, what we want to see is, can we create a community? Can we have people who will join us regularly to further explore psychological health and safety issues, ask questions live, get them answered live by industry experts. And every now and again, we might even have a surprise guest that will join us. So today, like I said, we're going to talk about psychosocial risk assessment. One of the bits of feedback that we have received since the last live panel was that, some people either found it too complex still, and they need to break it down further and really get down into the basics of what is psychosocial risk, how to measure it, how to control risks. We're not going to go so much into control today. We are going to focus more on risk assessment, but these will be a lot less formal than our normal podcasts. And we encourage you to ask questions as we progress. Don't wait till the end. We will open up for live Q&A at the end, but please feel free if you have any burning questions to ask them as we go. So I've got Alicia with us today. How are you doing, Alicia?
Not too bad, Jason. I just ate. It's 6 o'clock my time. You're in Perth, so you're a bit earlier. I was getting a bit peckish, so I just ate half a bag of potato chips before, and I'm feeling a bit sick, but never mind. I couldn't wait for dinner.
Getting enough carbs. Yeah, that's one of the benefits of being the boss. I get to choose the time zone. So it is 4 p.m. in Perth. So we're still within normal business hours, which is great. Hopefully we've got some people. I can see someone here from Oman. Hi, Mark from Oman. Hopefully we've got some UK people as well, given that I think it's 9 a.m. in the UK for this. But Alicia, you had a community of practice meeting with some of your friends from Victoria who are interested in psychological health and safety, and they had some feedback on the live panel. And I believe it was them that said that, they still needed to explore this in a bit more basic terms, if you like.
Yeah, so I meet with just a group of fellow psych health and safety professionals or people that are working in OH&S, OHR in that space. We meet every month, and our last catch up, we were just talking in general about how to assess for psych hazards or how to get information from your workforce around, what's actually happening and the perception of what's impacting on wellbeing from a work perspective. And we were talking about assessment, and one of the things that came up was whether it's people in that OH&S space or HR space or, staff in general, not really understanding what psychosocial that word means, or psychosocial risk assessment, or, how do you talk about psychosocial risk assessment to your staff so they understand it, not, if you're just talking about psychosocial risks or, well-being is very well understood, but that word, as soon as you start saying psychosocial factors, there's probably it's probably still too technical at this stage. So we were talking about how to explain it to people, really, to your staff.
Yeah, and one of the bits of feedback on that we received as well is that there still seems to be confusion between risk assessment of individual risk versus workplace or systematic risk, if you like. So would you like to have a go at that first, Alicia?
So, anything can really impact your well-being inside the workplace or outside the workplace. So we say there's work-related factors, and then there's personal factors. So a lot of organizations, I think, when they start looking at assessing well-being in the workplace, they'll ask their staff about what they think is impacting their well-being using that umbrella term. And if you don't know from as a staff member, if you don't know what workplace psychosocial risk factors are, you might miss that. You might not have an understanding of, when you're talking about or you're providing feedback on your well-being, you might not understand, things like how change is being managed or how much autonomy I have in my role. You might not understand that this is a space to be talking about that stuff. You might be referring to the programs that your workplace might have, like stress management training or anything that's already happening, an EAP service. You might just talk about those because you're not really aware of well-being from that work perspective. So I think that's where things are at now. When things are being assessed in workplaces, there'll be, assessment of well-being, and then the well-being programs either that may exist or that staff think might be good for their well-being, like mindfulness or anything focused on that individual person.
Yeah. So what we're really trying to get down to when it comes to psychosocial risk assessment is not looking at some of the protective programs that are in place for people when they are distressed. So your mindfulness-based practice or, your EAPs and that sort of thing. What we're looking at is what are the things that we're doing to understand and address the root causes of work-related stress. And as you mentioned, some of them are lack of job control or autonomy, as it's also known as, just having too high workloads, incivility, bullying, harassment, sexual harassment, there's a lot of them, but basically anything in the design or management of work that contributes to work-related stress. And we're particularly interested in those work-related stresses that are ongoing. So if you think about, work demands like having to work 10 to 14 hours a day to keep on top of everything, and that just being continuous without a break, or very extreme levels of work-related stress. So exposure to occupational violence or bullying and harassment would be an example of those. So when we talk about psychosocial risk assessment, what we're really talking about is understanding the root cause of work-related stress. We're not trying to identify if people are mentally ill or how distressed they are or how burnt out they are. Those are symptoms of a systemic problem, potentially. What we're trying to do is to get down to the root cause and address it at the root cause. And that's really what the health and safety lens is all about. It's applying risk management to understanding and controlling the source of harm or potential harm, if you like. Yeah. So one of the things we need to consider when considering psychosocial risk assessment, and maybe we didn't explain it well enough on the panel last week, was when to do it. Obviously, a good idea to get into a periodic measurement of risks and hazards. You might also do it in response to a hazard that has emerged or someone has become harmed, or if an employee or one of their representatives, so like a health and safety representative, for example, reports a potential hazard, then it might be worthwhile doing a broader assessment of the psychosocial risks within the work environment. One of the things that did come up in the panel was people were asking, well, do we need to use a survey? Because that was the focus of what Adam Nebs was talking about the use of surveys to identify psych hazards and the associated risks. You don't always need to use a survey. You can obviously just talk to people or have an interview. What a survey will give you, though, is at least a quantifiable measure of the risk potentially that's present. One of the other reasons you may decide to do a psychosocial risk assessment is that the regulator has been on your back and said, hey, look, you've actually had reports of psychosocial hazards, or you've had a number of psychological injuries. So maybe it's something that you need to investigate further and maybe force you to do something. So I couldn't think of anyone better actually to talk about that angle than one of our good friends of the Psych, Health and Safety podcast from the UK, Peter Kelly. And I believe Peter is going to join us right now from his car.
How are you?
Hey, Pete. Good to see you, mate.
Peter Kelly. I didn't know you were joining us. This is a surprise.
It is Dr. Pappas. Dr. Pappas, obviously, she's a legend in this realm. Yeah, absolutely. Look, as regulators, what we're interested in is, have you identified the risks? And I'm totally where yourself and Alicia are at, which is you're looking at the problem, not the solution. Once someone's got mental health issues, your risk assessment, it comes down to the individual level, but it's effectively what we want you to do is to show what you're doing at an organizational level. That's what we're all about, aren't we? Too much focus in well-being is about the individual, same on work-related stress. So looking at those from a regular perspective, you need to show quite clearly what you've done, and what did you do about the problem or about the hazard that you'd identified. I do think that the time for more proactive regulation is definitely here. It's been here for 10 years, but I mean, it's really here now. I think it's important that we change the narrative, and that's what you guys are doing through these webinars. And actually, this is the duty. This is not like something that you should just think it's a nice to. This is something you should be doing. You should be managing your people's psychosocial risk at work, because it's the seminal occupational health issue of this generation and the generations to come, because we've allowed technology and systems and processes to run riot, and we've not designed them around the individual. And then we've gone, oh, there's a disconnect between what we want to achieve with this system and what the person can deliver. And that's because we never actually designed those systems with the people in mind. I'm sure Dr. Pappas can during her work, and has seen examples of that. And the same with yourself, Jason, or Alicia. There you go. I'll call you Alicia.
You can call me Peter. All good.
Yeah, so sorry to throw that one on you, Alicia. On your first live episode, we've just had a surprise guest drop in, Peter Kelly, but you guys know each other quite well.
We do.
We
go
do,
way
yeah. Well, listen, we actually went to an island in Italy, Ischia, didn't we? Yeah.
Ischia, yes, we did.
Sounds very romantic.
No. What it was I snore, so I was at one end of the hotel. So, but
it was a pre-conference 1 week holiday.
Yeah.
Meet up in Italy. I think now I'm stuck in Australia now, Peter.
Yeah. And we did spend like 2 days with Alicia's fascination with George Clooney, trying to find him on Lake Como, but that didn't really happen. So it's not all fun and games when we go to conferences. We do work, but in this instance, it was a good opportunity. But I just think this is such an amazing area to be in at the moment, and we've got a great opportunity here to improve people's experience of work and get them to go home healthy and get them to go home safe. And if the pandemic's taught us anything, it's about the management of that risk, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. And look, we do pitch this podcast mainly to health and safety practitioners. Obviously, we have HR and other people and cultural types on here as well. But I think the goal of all people and safety professionals is to get people to go home in as at least a good a state as when they arrived, if not in a better state, knowing that work, when done well, can have a positive benefit for people's well-being. But when we look at the statistics from the latest labour force survey over there, obviously it paints a really dire picture of the state of workplace mental health, with 46% of all non-fatal injuries and illnesses or days lost due to that being related to work-related stress, depression, and anxiety. So we're at a pretty low bar, aren't we, Pete? I mean, we can't do much worse. I mean,
we're at a low bar. And this is 1 week. People forget this is 1 week into the pandemic. This was March the 28th last year. So this is 1 week before we even got into this significant event that we're going through now. We're seeing an absolute tsunami of issues arising in people with mental health in key work services. Key worker services. The health, transportation, etc., where people have worked through, but actually they're now beginning to show problems with their mental health. I'm involved in a global summit for physician burnout, in a couple of weeks, and there's a huge issue there. 20% increases in sickness absence, depression and anxiety across the board in healthcare workers, and particularly in many physicians burnt out and wanting to leave a profession that they dedicated their lives to. There is a crisis of which we need to be way more proactive, and I'm really tired after 20 years in this area of waiting for them to be ill. The message is pretty clear. You can reduce the amount of people going off with depression and anxiety and stress. You can't eradicate it. Let's be open and honest. We can't take stress completely out of the workplace, but we've got to get better than managing it. And then rather than saying, you sort it out, it's your problem, you need to do something about it. Well, if the system's broken, if the system is, the fish analogy that we've used before, Jason, if the filter's broken, it doesn't matter how good my fish are, they're going to die, aren't they? And I think, we create toxins in workplaces, and then we say, you're going to have to be strong enough, but we don't actually, clean the water, do the filtering bit, and do that. And that, for me, what we're doing at a risk assessment level is we're taking out the muck and the crap that's there and putting back in a better environment for people to work in. And we have to address this issue around technology and how we engage with technology. Having an iPhone, which can hold, or a Samsung, let's not, whatever, can hold 10,000 files. When we first started out in 20 years ago, and it's now nearly 35 years since the computers came in, if you envisaged that you could physically hold something that's got that much capability, you'd gone, you couldn't. But actually what's come with that is responsibility, and people are not showing responsibility, are they, Alicia? Sometimes people are not switching off. Mm-hmm. They don't feel they can switch off, and they don't switch off because they're permanently connected. And that's going to that has come through this pandemic. What we've seen is people being permanently on because they're working from home. Those that were furloughed, as you are at the moment, I'll say furloughed, but that, as you go into lockdown, you're going to have to work from home. You're both in your rooms here, and that is your space. How do you cut off from that space? How do you offer support to people? One of the things I've done, as you know, is I do this 2:00. People still turn up at 2:00 because they want to have a chat and have a coffee. Obviously, I'm off on holidays at the moment, so I haven't been there for the last few days. But yeah, we are. But I was thinking when you were talking, Alicia, it's the language. We have a language issue about here's psychosocial risk. Here's this. We as professionals have to simplify what we are talking about. And that's what these podcasts are doing. It's making that language simpler. It's making that, because when I go into a factory or in a work environment, I say, have you got a psychosocial risk assessment? They look at me and go, what the hell's that? Have you got a risk assessment for stress? Oh, I get that. Oh, but no, why would we have stress? And then you go through what stress might look like in a work: high demands, low control, and poor support, change and control, and etc. And they go, oh yeah, that's happening all the time. And then so I and the inspectors have to educate them on what we mean by that. Yeah. Well, once they get it, they go, oh, there's something we can do about that. So.
Yeah, I think there's a massive education piece that needs to happen, because when you just mention that phrase, psychosocial risk, people don't, like I said earlier, understand exactly what that means, and you really have to break it down and explain and give examples of what a risk or a hazard is. So even when you talk about hazards and controls, if you're not an OH&S person, or you don't have that background as a professional, and you're talking even from it to someone in HR, and you talk about hazards and controls from a psychological perspective, people have no clue what you're talking about. So, a hazard is a work factor that's going to potentially have a negative impact or a positive one on your mental health. What does that look like? And then a control is an action that you're going to implement to address that hazard if it's identified. So hazards and controls, we talk about it like, it's everyday language, but people just don't understand what that really means.
Yeah, like I got a problem. What do I do to sort it out? And it's identifying that problem, isn't it? So yeah. I mean,
and the control is not necessarily a simple one. It's not as if you've got, from a physical perspective, a hazard might be something that's in the wrong place, and the control would be to move it.
Absolutely, yeah.
About a psych hazard, and it's a systems level hazard. The control or the action you take might have many, many, many steps, and you've got to take this integrated approach and talk to HR and OH&S and line managers, and take a systematic approach to implement this control. It's very different to just a quick response.
Yeah, you can understand why some HR professionals might just want to give everyone a mindfulness app, because it sounds a lot easier to do that than to actually take a more systematic approach to controlling identified risks.
Let's give them a mindfulness app and make them realize how rubbish their workplace is, because you're making them mindful. I mean, this is the outcome of these things. This is what people are surprised when they go, "Oh, I didn't realize that would happen." I'm like, well, you've made them mindful. What have you done about the workplace? What have you done to change the workplace? And just to give you an insight, it took us a day and a half to define psychosocial risk in 45,003.
Yeah,
a day and a half.
That's what happens though when you have 76 countries represented in a committee trying to work these things out.
Yeah, but we got to a position where it was okay. But there were absolute moments of despair where your hands are in your head. You're like, oh, can we get around it? But and as professionals, they find it difficult to define that definition. Throughout the development of the standard, I constantly said, who is the audience? Make the language simple so that and I'm not, because then people can understand what it is, forgetting 47% of all, 57% of all occupational health in the UK is work-related stress, depression, and anxiety. Okay, 17.9 million days lost, 828,000 people off, up 200,000 amount of people off from the previous year.
And pre-pandemic, as you mentioned before as well.
Pre-pandemic. And you know what? This year potentially the numbers might go down because people may not be reporting, but I can guarantee you can have a conversation with me next year and it'll come through, because it's starting to come through now. And it will continue to come through for the next 10 years as we deal with the consequences of massive changes to the way people worked and how they worked.
So one of the things, Pete, that I want to do is to demystify further, okay, what is psychosocial risk assessment? Because it was clear, like for some, it was too low. And if you're an org psych or a seasoned health and safety professional, maybe we were talking at too low a level for you. But I think the majority of people still need this simplified further for them, because we're just not seeing enough action. There's still too much focus on individuals and symptoms and reactive kind of helping employees deal with distress, rather than looking at the work environment and how that contributes to distress in the first place.
Because it's cheap, Jason. It's cheap. It's cheap to do individual programs of work. It's cheap to put someone in a course. It's cheap to teach them mindfulness. Where the actual action happens is where you put something in that changes the system. And that, in the end, is cheaper. This is what does me in. You think it's costing you more to do a systemic change, but if you look at the cost benefits of doing a systemic change over the individual things that you put in, the person who's doing these individual mechanisms will still go off ill. And what you're doing by putting a systemic thing is you're reducing the probability of them going off ill. So you already, from a cost benefit perspective, are ahead. And it's like, for me, it's any health and safety risk. If I put a guarding on machine, I know that's going to stop people sticking their hands into a lathe and them losing a digit. It's a clear win-win, isn't it? Now, what we're doing here is we don't even put a guard in. And I sometimes use the illustration that what you're trying to do at a systemic level is to put a guard in front of it. That's what we're trying to do when we look at psychological processes in work. What can we do to stop that person being made ill? Put a guarding, like we do with any other health and safety issue, in front of it. And it's as simply, if we do that, if we look at that, sorry, that was smooth FM.
We also have a smooth FM in Melbourne anyway.
Yeah, it helps to soothe my soul. But yeah, that's all it is. You're putting a guarding. It's a health and safety issue. Put the guarding around mental health, okay? And do not tell me it's too hard, okay? Because everything is hard.
Yeah, I also think you're saying it's cheaper. I also think it's easier, and because I've had this experience personally, that when I start trying to change the narrative in a workplace around what workplace mental health is, it's not, well-being is not individual well-being strategies. It's you have to look at organizational well-being, and this is this systemic integrated approach. When I start talking about what that looks like and give examples of these hazards, these work-related factors, when I initially went into a workplace, the response I got was, that's not our remit when my remit was well-being. So I went into a newly created role, mental health and well-being manager. 3 months later, the role got renamed psychological safety, because I had to spend a lot of time changing the narrative, and when you're going into I think this is still rife, this understanding of well-being. This is your remit, or people that are in those well-being roles, they actually are still thinking about well-being as a certain function at that individual level, and not an OH&S, HR, this integrated approach. It's not even on the radar. And I think people will get working in organizations unless they can influence higher up to understand this is what we mean and this is what needs to happen. People can try all they want in those roles. If you're an OH&S person or an HR professional, you need to push it. You need to influence and change the narrative in a workplace. So that personal perspective, I had a lot of challenge trying to, when I say talk about the language, trying to, I'm not going to say convince, but it's influence through talking about things from an evidence-based perspective. And now we've got ISO 45003. Yes, I think some professionals will get pushback as well.
Yeah, and that kind of ties in with Tina's question that I can see here in the YouTube chat. How do you get organizations to see the need to step up and take responsibility, act on the duty of care? And that, if we talk about ISO 45003, relates to clause 5, which is about leadership commitment. How do we get that? And as you were saying, Alicia, working in an internal psych health and safety role, you can't tell leadership what they have to do. You have to influence. So do you have any tips to people who are seeking to influence top management, where you're not in a position of authority to tell them what to do, like Peter might be if he's speaking on the regulator's behalf, saying you actually need to bring in psych risk assessment? How do you influence internally?
Be really pushy. No. I have a big mouth and I'm very assertive. So, but it is definitely a big challenge, and it really depends how your organizational structure is. So it depends how many levels up you have to influence, I think, as well. So just as an example, where I probably had 3-ish levels before I got to, most senior, so CEO level. So I can't go from my level straight to the CEO because there's hierarchies and processes and whatnot. So it's a systematic influence. So really, you know, whoever your manager is, or whoever that senior manager is, or director, or whoever it is above you, really building a relationship with that person to educate them around. Now we've got ISO 45003 to educate them around that. This is where we have to go. So what I did was I had a position, and the position title got changed because I said, you've hired me to come into this role to improve outcomes for your staff from a mental health perspective. So if you want to do this successfully, you need to look at what the evidence says. And now we've got the guidelines, and the evidence says we need to take this integrated approach, and ultimately, you know, we need to prevent harm, so we don't get into these reactive type of responses or actions when someone's already unwell. And this is what that means, and this is what that looks like. We have to assess for work factors. You know, we have to understand in our context what's potentially or is already contributing to high stress for our staff or distress from a work perspective, and then what can we do to mitigate or reduce that risk. If we don't do that, I use that fishbowl analogy all the time too. If we don't do that, we're still going to have staff going, taking sick leave, potentially putting in claims, and nothing will change. We can do band-aid solutions, which does look like those individual wellbeing approaches. Not to say that we shouldn't be doing those, but they will only go so far. They're not going to prevent harm. So understand your organizational structure, and that you actually need to influence at that highest level. And if you can, you need gravitas to have any effect for change. So propose for like a Psych Health and Safety Committee, and get the right people in that committee or that working group.
Yeah. So you have to influence slowly, deliberately, strategically. You can't just get straight to the CEO in a lot of instances.
Yeah. Sometimes easier if your organization isn't as big, but I'm talking about, you know, enterprise level. It's a more strategic approach.
And I'm entirely in agreement with Alicia, because I've got to go before I get a parking ticket. But here's one of the things I want to talk about. Well-being isn't this ethereal concept that just exists out there. If we want to make a difference in a workplace, well-being is part of that process. It's not being well in work is not the absence of mental ill health. It's actually more about the systems and things that you have in work that allow people to feel engaged, feel as though they're actually benefiting, and they get some sense of identity from being in that work. And all of that was really important. You know, when we in the early days, and when we were working in the coal mines, the miners used to say, you know, we're miners, this is what we do. Their sense of who they were was there, you know, their purpose, and it was a horrible environment to work in, but there was a definite camaraderie, and you could argue in some respects that their emotional well-being was being catered for in that respect. Like, you know, and I think I do think that actually we target it down and try and put well-being into little trunkets of bits and say well-being HR, well-being OHS. Well-being has to really be the system and process and work that facilitates the safe and healthy return of the worker at the end of the day, is it not? And we can do this. We do it on every physical risk out there. Well, not every physical risk, because obviously there's some accidents, but we do this. We can take a systemic approach to those risks. Why are we not taking a systemic approach to mental health? Why are we not acknowledging that actually a consequence of poorly managed systems that lead to mental ill health or to lead to incidents and accidents? You know, if I investigate an accident, one of the questions I'm going to ask is, what was the environment like? What was going on? How was that person before that accident occurred? They're the kind of that gives you insight to the state of the person who's going in, and then that adds an extra element to it. So the extra element is there something else about what went on that led to that accident? And as and what these are called the influencing factors, or PIFs. But these are part of that investigation element where you're looking at it. So I look to see is there something in the system that potentially led to this happening the way it did. We go back to the Swiss cheese model, didn't it? It's the old school stuff, isn't it? Swiss cheese model, but
even newer school, talking about just culture. We do everything in the physical health and safety space to defer away from individual responsibility and go, well, yeah, the person made a poor decision, but what led to them making a poor decision? They were tired at the time. What did the roster look like? So
yeah, absolutely. You need to look at it. It's been great, but
thanks for dropping in.
This traffic warden's got his little device. I'm trying to smile at him. Probably not going to go too far, is it? But listen, yes. And Alicia, sorry, mate, it was Jason's idea. So he just he thought he
told me 5 minutes before you.
No, he wanted to.
Surprise, Alicia.
Anyway, I will talk to you offline.
All right, mate, that's cool. Listen, keep up with the amazing work you guys are doing. This is our time. This is our time. Okay, let's make it happen for people. Let's make it happen for the workers. Let's create workplaces that are fundamentally about improving people's health and not making them ill. Because there's no excuse when we got a number of things and interventions out there that we're not doing this, except we just think it's too hard. And it is hard.
Thanks for your time, Pete.
Hopefully it'll change.
Yeah,
cheers,
we know you got a lot
guys.
of going on personally, so thank you for taking some time out to check in.
All right, no worries, guys. Take care.
See you.
And all right, bye, mate.
See you soon.
Bye.
Well, there you go, Alicia. That was our first surprise guest.
Thanks, Jason.
I feel like it's a reunion show.
Haven't spoken to Pete for ages.
Yeah, well, that was good for a little catch up. Hopefully, you guys can connect again offline. Tina's just mentioned that the stigma around workplace mental health is still quite high, and depends on where you are in the world. In particular, I know Tina's in Qatar, which is probably a little bit behind Australia. I think Australia is leading the way in a lot of regards in relation to stigma reduction, although obviously it's still prevalent. But what we really need to do, and we've gone on a few tangents, is to talk a bit about, is that Joelle jumping in on the comments now as well? Hi, Joelle. Is just get back to this topic of psychosocial risk assessment. So one thing I want to separate out is this idea of hazard identification versus risk assessment. So hazard identification is the process of identifying the work-related stresses in a work group or within an organizational context. So remember, work-related stresses could be things like, lack of control or autonomy. So not being able to say when you start work or finish work, or when you take a break, or how you do different aspects of your work. It might be just pure workload and time that you're spending at work, which then also reduces work-life balance. It might be things around relationships in the workplace. It might be things around just clarity about where your responsibilities begin and finish. So anything that can cause people angst or distress or stress, ongoing or high levels. Again, we're not talking, remember, about individual factors. Okay, that's a different type of mental health risk. What we're talking about here is psychosocial. So that's influence on social aspects on someone's individual cognition or well-being. So in the case of work, it's the work environment or the design of work that we're particularly interested in. So there's a number of ways that you can identify hazards. It might be through conversations with people. It might be through focus groups. It might be through surveys. But first step is to identify, okay, what are the key things that we need to be worried about in terms of work-related stress? The next thing we need to do, if we think about the risk management framework, is to assess the likelihood and consequence that harm is going to occur. Now, when we talk about harm occurring in relation to work-related stress, there's two things in particular that we're worried about. One is distress. So, and Alicia might talk more to this in a moment, seeing as she's the clean psych on the team and knows more about the acute stress than myself, but also burnout. So burnout, which is exhaustion and cynicism caused by just excessive exposure to work-related stress. Actually, Alicia, you didn't know this, but we caught up with someone who has been doing a bit of work in the UK with healthcare workers around burnout, and she quoted a stat that in the UK that physician burnout was costing something like $4.6 billion in both immediate costs, so healthcare costs, as well as lost productivity costs as well. So burnout is definitely an outcome that we're trying to avoid by understanding and mitigating psychosocial hazards. The other one is psychosocial distress, or psychological distress, I should say. So what does psychological distress look like, Alicia?
So if we think about distress, it's as a term, it's a bit of an umbrella term that represents any type of kind of negative emotion. It can be feeling really low, down, anxious, fearful, scared, irritable. So anything that's making you feel distressed from they're symptoms of something, whether it's work-related or personal factors or a combination of both. Look, we're in a pandemic at the moment, so that's got its own challenges as well. So it's understanding what distress looks like, this umbrella term for, I just say, negative emotions or emotions that are making you feel like it's harder to cope, and then looking at why that's occurring.
Yeah. So when we are interested in looking at the likelihood and consequence, really the consequence, we're not talking about like we would with, say, major hazard type risk assessment, where we're looking at, maybe multiple fatalities is possibly, the worst possible consequence. The consequence that we're talking about here, if we put it on a risk matrices, is a burnout or distress. I mean, we could talk about worst case, which might be suicide, self-harm, that kind of thing. But what we're more interested in, I guess, is likelihood of psychological injury and time off work required because someone mentally needs to recover. Yeah.
So distress is, everything's on a continuum, right? When we talk about mental health, so from mild to severe. So when you're talking about severe distress, you'll have people, at the point where they're very distressed, that they're not able to work or even function very well, that they might be suicidal and things like that. Whereas on the milder side, you'll see signs of poor psychological health, from feeling stressed out or irritable, snappy, grumpy, just showing that it's harder to regulate your emotions at that point, and then it goes kind of down that continuum. So
yeah. Now, one of the things that we discussed on the live panel, particularly or focused on because of Adam's research, which Angela Martin had supervised, was around psychosocial risk assessment using a survey. And one of the things that he's identified in his research, and we've definitely identified in our own practice using a technology tool which helps companies to assess psychosocial hazards and risks, is that the common or popular way of assessing psychosocial risks through the employee perception style survey really doesn't get you down to risk. It might help you to identify the key hazards within a work group or in an organization, like, again, lack of control or conflict or what have you, but it doesn't tell you the likelihood that someone will be harmed as a result of that exposure. Typically, we get workload is high, workload is low, autonomy is high, autonomy is low, but it doesn't take into account individual preferences around working styles and how much autonomy someone craves or what have you. So it's a problem because that is the most common way. If we look at things like the HSE stress indicator tool, the Guarding Minds at Work survey, the People at Work survey, these are all the surveys that are available through Canada, UK and Australia. They're all that employee perception style. And the best we can do really is get a score, which we match to a benchmark, and we can determine are we above the benchmark or below the benchmark. But doesn't tell us the likelihood that someone will get harmed. Now, actually, someone on LinkedIn was talking about, hey, look, when it comes to, say, dust exposure or noise exposure, we have exposure thresholds. We know above that level or below that level that someone is more likely to be harmed. And that is that's the absolute minimum or maximum that we're going to go to, because we know if we cross that threshold, that people are going to be more susceptible to harm. And we don't have the same thing when it comes to psychosocial hazards. And I think it's because of the way that we have been assessing risk, and just understanding if workload's high or low or autonomy is high or low doesn't necessarily get us to that risk level. And that's why we're advocating for a different way of assessing psychosocial risk, and that is more of an occupational hygiene approach. And if we think about, say, noise exposure as a good comparison, to understand the risk of hearing loss, we need to understand the severity of noise that people are exposed to. We then need to understand the frequency that people are exposed to that noise. We need to know the duration of the exposure. And we feel if we can get to that same point when it comes to exposure to psychosocial hazards, so understanding severity of distress caused by that hazard, the frequency that people experience that distress, and then the duration of that, then we can match that to outcomes like burnout and psychosocial distress. And then we can actually then come up with a predictive algorithm to determine a risk level. And over time, once we get enough data, then we can start to develop these thresholds where we can say, well, look, really, you don't want to cross this threshold because at a group level, you are then more likely to have psychological injuries occur. So I think it's, the way we use employee perception style surveys at the moment is really a throwback to how we've been, doing surveys with people around psychosocial factors for the last, several decades. It's really from that whole paper and pencil style approach, and really all we've done with these modern surveys that are online is that's the only thing we've changed. We put it into an online context. We're still asking 3 or 4 questions in slightly different ways to cover a construct reliably, but we're not necessarily getting down to a risk level like we need to. And we really need to understand the severity, frequency, duration of hazard exposure to really get down to that risk. So that's something we're advocating. If no one, if anyone who is listening hasn't actually done the training on the 45,003 Academy on how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment, I would encourage you to check it out. And in module 3 in particular, we talk about using a technology-based approach to identify hazards at scale and to assess risk, as opposed to just employee perceptions of work environment. And it's a little bit different to what has been proposed previously, taking more of an occupational hygiene approach. So, I think that's definitely where we need to get to. Because I know, Alicia, in your previous role, you did use an employee perception style survey, but then it required a lot of follow-up to actually understand the risks in more detail.
Yeah. So if you run a survey and you're actually assessing for psychosocial hazards, so these work-related factors that can influence mental health in a positive or negative way, if you're just assessing for those risks and you're basing it on the employee's perspective of, there's 1 or 2 or 3 questions around a particular factor, you need to make sense of the data that comes back. So even if there's benchmarks or not, it's, if workload is being perceived as high across the board or for this particular work group, we assume that because the workload is coming up as high, it's getting flagged as a potential hazard, that we're saying, okay, well, that's a risk to that work group's or that work area's staff mental health. But is it? Like you said earlier, or can't remember if it was today or in another podcast episode, some people work longer hours, but they're not necessarily at risk, because if you've got a high level of autonomy in your role, you can, perform your work role with a lot of flexibility. You might work 44 hours a week as an example. Even though that's higher than the norm, it doesn't mean that you're at risk for burnout or high psychological distress, because you're kind of working a bit more on your own terms, and you can juggle your other responsibilities in your life around work, and that might work really well for you. So just because a psych hazard is identified as, high, it doesn't mean that it's a risk. So I think, it's really important to you ask employees if that is happening, frequently. What is the impact of that for you, and what's the severity of that? So is it a risk or is it not?
Yeah, that's it. And if you use the employee perception style survey, you really do need to allocate a lot of time to unpacking it. So just be careful that even if it is a free survey tool that you are using, you still need a budget time to unpack all the data with employees through further consultation to understand severity, frequency, duration. And that's really where Joelle and I were thinking a while ago, like, well, on the back of those, if you're going to do it at scale, say do an employee perception survey, maybe we can skip the whole focus group, because large companies aren't going to do this with every single work group, unpack the results the way you need to. Maybe we come up with a new way of asking the questions, which actually gets to the heart of it, which is severity, frequency, duration. But then the more we looked at it, we're like, well, we believe we can actually probably just skip the whole employee perception survey altogether and just get straight to severity, frequency, duration for each psych factor. So, really hopeful that this is a paradigm shift for how we assess psychosocial risk, which is operationally a lot easier to swallow, a 5 to 10 minute assessment versus say a 30-minute assessment, and actually getting that level of data without the need for such lengthy focus groups. Alicia, one of the other things we talked about in the live panel was around preparation. So a lot of people love to rush into a survey. They go, oh, great, we've got a survey tool or a piece of technology. Let's just, get as many people as possible. But it's important to prepare the organization. We talked a little bit about with Peter, thanks to Tina's question as well, around getting leadership support for doing this, and the need to influence. What does top management support look like? Given that you've obviously come from a role where you did need support to do this, I mean, you were asking for a lot of time from the business, people's time to both do a survey and then do follow-up consultation as well. Some companies, the reason I ask is, some people go, oh yeah, we got top management support. In fact, our CEO got out and talked about how he was once suicidal and, his path to recovery. Or, we have top management support because we have an EAP available and we run a lunch and learn twice a year for Are You OK Day and for Mental Health Awareness Month. Is that top management support?
That's probably promoting psychological safety in the workplace. So role modeling, being open and honest, and vulnerability around mental health. So to normalize mental ill health, to encourage help seeking and so forth, but it doesn't actually have the outcome of, leading to any systematic change in your work environment. So there's, and we've talked about this before on podcasts, the difference in terms and language. So psychological safety is that you're creating or influencing the culture to be more psychologically safe, that you can role model these vulnerabilities and talk about it, and it's okay. But it doesn't address psych health and safety, which is around preventing harm in the first place, from that work perspective. So if you're wanting to, in the planning phase is really crucial, rather than just rolling out a survey, it's thinking about the communication strategy around that. So you want your top management to be communicating, it's got to come from that level, or you've got to set it up through multiple channels. How are we going to get the message across to all of our staff or a particular work group that this is really important? This is what we're doing. The aim is to assess for psychological risks, or anything in the workplace that may be contributing to our staff's mental health. And from this assessment, from this survey, we're committed to developing actions, which are controls, actions to mitigate any kind of issues that get flagged. So that's why we really need your feedback, and that we really value your feedback, because if you paint the picture like that, the commitment's coming from the organization that, this is what we're doing. We're asking about your experience of work, and then we're going to respond to anything that's coming up as, where possible, anything that's coming up as a red flag that's having a negative impact on mental health, not targeting individual well-being. This is coming from an organizational perspective.
Yeah, because I've seen some employees quite patronized when, top management will say, oh, mental health's really important. So, here's a mindfulness app, or, here's a lunch and learn. And they go, well, we're working, around the clock at the moment. You've got these ridiculous, deadlines that aren't tied to anything except, your own kind of, desires. There's no reason that we need to have these deadlines in place. And you're trying to fob us off with a mindfulness app. So actually getting to the heart of the matter and going, no, we're actually interested in understanding more about your experience of work and how we can work together to make work not suck. How do we make it actually a positive place where everyone has that ability to flourish?
Yeah, and that's the benefit of doing the follow-up consultations. So again, from previous experience, even that was an employee perception type of a survey, not necessarily a risk assessment. We still measured psychological or psychosocial hazards, but then we consulted with staff to get more information from different work areas and work groups and different staff cohorts. And we were, coming up with the solutions, the actions, the controls from staff themselves where possible. So it's really good to be able to, I often get asked, okay, what happens next after a risk assessment? Or this came up from the risk assessment. Now what? How do we respond? So it's always a good idea to think about how you can include your staff in coming up with the responses. And that's actually promoting good mental health for your staff, because you're including them in generating, actions and in the decision making where possible. So that's a protective factor, or that's something that we can promote. Staff input. They're not necessarily going to make the final decision, but at least they're heard. They can feel validated, and they're contributing to, a change in strategy or some controls or some solutions that are going to come out to make this a better place to work.
Yeah, and I spoke about that on a post on LinkedIn today, actually. Like, the typical way we do employee engagement surveys is HR will get all the data back, and over a period of months, they'll review that data and they'll come up with maybe some high level kind of strategies or plans on how to address the key themes that came out of the employee perception survey. But if we're talking about doing a psychosocial risk assessment, we are potentially identifying risk that someone will be psychologically harmed if we don't take action, which means there's a higher need to respond quickly. So when you are planning your psychosocial risk assessment, you should also be planning as quickly as possible, preferably within a week or two of the risk assessment occurring, to follow up with staff, as you say, Alicia, and get that next level of feedback in. Okay, we've identified these risks. Let's find out more about them. And you tell us, what do you think would actually work here to address that? So you do need to, in terms of your planning for your risk assessment, whether it's via interviews or focus groups or surveys, to plan for that next follow-up action. We're actually probably going to identify risks here. So that means we need to do something in a timely fashion to address it. I love Julie in the chat. She mentioned Peter Kelly as a Jamie Oliver of workplace mental health. Probably because he pops up everywhere, right? Like, even in our podcast, Alicia, he just pops in and says hello and has a few things to say. But he's someone who's been at this for a couple of decades now, right? His name is one of the names on the management standard in the UK. He's been pushing for this systematic approach to workplace mental health, focusing on work design versus the individual approach for many years. So it's good to see that he's willing to contribute, even when he's got some personal things going on at the moment. Always being willing to jump in and share some words. Alicia, one of the things I do want to do briefly is bring up another question, this one from Mark on the chat. What will be a good approach to identifying hazards for those that have worked from home during the pandemic and those that may continue to work from home after? So work from home is one of the big workplace cultural adjustments that has happened as a result of the pandemic. And obviously that with that change in work, obviously that's brought in other potential psych hazards. So any words for Mark around identifying hazards and I guess the risks of those hazards specifically with work from home?
Yeah. Look, I think that's affecting many employees globally at the moment. So it's thinking about when you're working from home versus in an office, what does that mean from a psychosocial perspective? So when you're in an office environment or out in the field or whatever your job is, work is usually a social. That's why it's psychosocial factors. The social aspect is work. It's a work environment is another social environment. But when we're working from home, that social environment changes and we're relying really on technology to keep us connected, phone, video. So, it's thinking about what's the impact of that on employee mental health. Are people still feeling connected to their peers, their colleagues, their managers? Are they able to check in? Are they, gone? Are there opportunities for having incidental conversations in the workplace? These water cooler conversations. You don't just bump into people in your office or in your lounge room, home office or in your lounge room anymore. You actually have to make arrange a Zoom meeting or speak to someone on Teams in chat to have an interaction. So it's just thinking about what's the impact, how is that social environment changed, and then what's the impact, and is the organization or your workplace making changes to the way that they do work in this changed environment, meaning are there policies in place? Are there guidelines for managers in terms of how to lead teams remotely? Because if there's not, and there's no transition to that, to even increase manager capability to manage teams remotely, you might have a lot of people working from home that aren't getting the one-on-ones with their managers that they normally would. This all has to be scheduled in. They're not getting checked on. There might be less team meetings. So you actually need to think about, from your, at the team level and at the organizational level, what's changed and how has that affected the way that we work? And what's the consequences to someone's mental health? So disconnection and loneliness is a big thing that's come up.
Yeah, Julie's mentioned there's some, terms that people could use when they're having a conversation, like feeling overwhelmed or not coping. But that's really, symptoms of someone being distressed or at that level where the work environment or the nature of work, plus all these other factors, individual or macro factors, might be influencing their mental health and well-being. One of the things that I mentioned a bit on the podcast is, a line manager or a health and safety professional can really only be expected to control the work-related factors. They can't be expected to manage the fact that someone's relationship is falling apart or they're behind on their mortgage. They can't manage the fact that there's a global pandemic that's happening, or economic instability and all the rests. But the work-related factors are definitely what they can do. So yeah, definitely making time to have conversations to ask people about work-related factors in particular, and maybe I'm a big advocate for improving the literacy of line managers, and particularly around psych factors and the things they should be asking for. What is workload right? Like, how are you being able to disconnect from work and separate your work time from your home time? How are your relationships at work going? Like you say, Alicia, there's that lack of water cooler conversation and that ability to have positive working relationships if you're all remote. So finding those opportunities this is a control, right? Finding those opportunities to replicate the social aspect of work where possible. But yeah, it's you could run periodic surveys, but probably the easiest way to do it is the line manager within their team just asking questions about, how's it going? What could we be doing in relation to how we're working remotely that would, be better for your work-life balance and your stress levels? Yeah. So that might be a simple, hazard risk assessment that you could do, on a weekly or fortnightly basis with your teams, particularly. I think we're feeling for those people who are in lockdown, either 6.0 or 1.0 if you're in Sydney.
Yeah, yeah, and I can see Mark's just making a few more comments there. How would I advise an organization on controls in a private house? So I think it is about ensuring that line managers are clear on how to support their staff and how to manage work in a remote setting. Because if your line managers don't know how to do that well or effectively, you're putting more stress on the line managers too, because they're kind of just in the same boat and probably struggling and not knowing where to start or what to do to ensure that they're managing their team effectively as well. So I'd say, talking to HR about, some organizations have, for example, leadership capability teams or organizational development teams. What do we have in place to support managers to effectively manage their teams in a remote way, given we're in a pandemic, especially.
Yeah. Well, I think we've gotten through a fair bit today, Alicia. Hopefully for those people who listen to the live panel and maybe were a little bit confused about some of the terms that we used and, the specific focus being on work design versus individual risk factors. Hopefully we've cleared up a few of those things. And hopefully for Tina and Mark, who asked some good questions, that we've given them some good advice. Good to see Nuz on there as well. I'll see you tomorrow, Nuz, on the webinar that you're hosting around ISO 45003. So it'll be good to reconnect with you there as well. But that will bring us to the end of today's episode. Hopefully everyone enjoyed the live format. We'll give it a shot again next week. So same time, Tuesday, 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, which is 9 a.m. British Standard Time. Feel free to jump in and get on the YouTube and ask your questions live. Next week, we'll be talking about the topic that we'll cover on the Monday podcast, which is to be advised. I'll let you know what that is on the Sunday, Monday, what that podcast will be. This will be released as a podcast on Thursday. So if anyone wants to re-listen to it or share it with their colleagues, feel free to share it through the Psych, Health and Safety podcast link wherever you listen to podcasts. So thanks, everyone, and we'll catch you next time.